huge debate over the federal and state government's decision to give Holden $275 million over 9 years. We had a big debate about what the assistance said about us as a nation. And in the end, it was reasonable to have this sort of debate. It was, after all, a lot of money. Yet, when we hand over $10 to $15 billion to the fossil fuel industry every year, there is no debate and there's no discussion. Why is it that $275 million over 9 years is worthy of debate, but $10 billion every year isn't? It's a shame there's no debate, because if there was, even ignoring the serious problems of climate change and the other environmental problems and issues, and we just focus on the economic issues, there's no case for subsidising fossil fuels. There's no positive economic spillovers or large benefits to society. Indeed, burning fossil fuels creates pollution, which is damaging to both humans and the environment. The fossil fuel industry is not in a temporary downturn. Indeed, the biggest recipient of these fossil fuel subsidies is actually the mining industry. An Australia Institute study found that the mining industry receives $4 billion a year from the federal government alone. This does not include substantial subsidies from state governments. We're talking about the mining industry, the most profitable industry in Australia, receiving $4 billion every year from the federal government. It defies common sense to believe that they need government assistance. The assistance they currently get only increases the amount of profit that they earn. In order to understand how to take away fossil fuel subsidies, you need to understand a bit about why they got there in the first place. Originally, the government was concerned about generating electricity and connecting every house to the grid. Electricity was a fantastic way to increase people's health and well-being. In fact, the government was not just subsidising it, the government owned it. Back before people were fully aware of the dangers of climate change, coal power seemed like a good idea or a good way to achieve that goal. As an aside, it's important to note that the government poured huge amounts of money into setting up electricity generation's distribution. This was a time when not just coal-fired power stations were being built, but also when the Snowy Mountain Hydro Scheme was constructed. At the time, the Snowy Mountain Hydro Scheme didn't need to show that it could pay itself back in 5 years. Looking back today, people don't say, wow, that was a colossal waste of money. I'm sure that the politicians who made that decision are red-faced and living in shame. There's nothing wrong with the idea that governments fund large infrastructure projects that will have benefits for decades to come. In fact, those kinds of projects make good economic sense. The fossil fuel industry was built on government subsidies. In fact, large parts of it was fully owned by the government. They were built before the full impacts of the environmental damage were known, but it's an industry that's used to getting subsidised, and it's an industry that will fight to keep them. So how does the fossil fuel industry get away with it? How do they manage to keep hold of these $10 billion worth of subsidies? Well, unlike the car industry, the mining industry receives most of its assistance from what's called tax concessions. Alright, that is, rather than getting cash from the government, they're allowed to pay less tax. These tax concessions are huge. So large, in fact, that the mining industry has the lowest average corporate tax rate of any industry in Australia. They pay on average just 14% compared to a national average of 21%. And you might know that the corporate tax rate is 30%. So they're paying on average 14% on a corporate tax rate of 30%. Because there's no actual transfer of cash. There's no line item in the budget that shows how much is going out. Instead, they're quietly paying less tax year by year. The second reason they've been able to hang on to these subsidies is that because the government generally, and this government in particular, has been particularly bad at standing up to vested interests. You only need to look at the debacle with the mining tax to see. Who would have thought that if you let the 3 largest mining companies in Australia design the mining tax, they would end up paying very little? The carbon price is another example of the government's inability to stand up to vested interests. The biggest polluters were able to get the government to pay over enormous amounts of compensation, including the most polluting industries getting 94.5% of their permits for free. So generally, this government and governments before it have been particularly bad at standing up to vested interests, and particularly to the fossil fuel industry. The rest of us, though, is a large group. and so we only have to pay a bit more tax each. But that bit more each adds up to billions of dollars for the fossil fuel industry. So while the incentive for each of us to stop the subsidies is small, the incentive for the fossil fuel industry to keep them is very, very large. As a result, the fossil fuel industry has a well-funded and organised lobby groups whose job it is to prevent those subsidies from being removed. So how do we remove these subsidies? The answer for the rest of us is to understand that this fight, if we're going to try and remove these subsidies, won't necessarily be won quickly. That it will require a constant campaign, and it requires us to constantly ask the government, why do they subsidise fossil fuels? And the reason that we can ultimately win this fight is because there's no good reason why you would subsidise the fossil fuel industry. It makes no sense from an environmental standpoint, it makes absolutely no economic sense, and it's fundamentally unfair that one industry should get such special treatment at the expense of the rest of us. And shortly Mark's going to talk about the campaign that they're launching here today that's going to try and help remove these subsidies. Of course, subsidising fossil fuel is not just a bad idea on economic grounds. If we're serious about climate change, it's a stupid thing to do on environmental grounds. Fossil fuel use is the biggest creator of greenhouse gases. Every dollar we spend subsidising fossil fuel is a dollar spent encouraging people to create more emissions. You can see how keen Australia is about tackling climate change by looking at the money the government is collecting to discourage us from creating greenhouse gas emissions through the carbon price, and compare that to the amount of money the government is spending to encourage us to create greenhouse gases through fossil fuel subsidies. The fact that they're doing both at the same time is a bit like a tug of war, with subsidies to fossil fuels on one side pulling against the carbon price on the other. If we look at it this way, we've got an infographic here that the Australia Institute put together. So you can see the giant mining truck is winning the tug of war against the electric car, and that's because the subsidies are beating the carbon price. The government is currently giving over $13 billion in subsidies to fossil fuel and only collecting about $7.7 billion from the carbon price. In fact, the really sad thing about this is that rather than introducing a carbon price, the government could have actually achieved more if it had simply scrapped subsidies to fossil fuels. But the government now has a great opportunity to make real inroads into changing Australia's reliance on fossil fuels. Taking away subsidies to fossil fuels will not only reduce people's incentive to use them, but will also free up billions of dollars for the government to subsidise things that can help climate change. And we're not talking about small amounts. To put this in context, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which was set up with the carbon price, has been given $10 billion to spend on renewable energy out to 2020, so over about 7 years. The fossil fuel industry gets at least that much every year. Imagine what we could do with that amount of money. You can't go forward until you stop going backwards, and it's time to stop subsidising fossil fuels. Thank you.
A tug of war. So that's all we need to do. Get a whole bunch of activists on one side and Julia Gillard and Wayne Swan on the other side. And cool. But as we know, it's not just the political leaders that are lobbying for this. And as Matt just told us, the fossil fuel industry has a very strong vested interest and have been defending these subsidies for a very, very long time. I'd like to invite Mark Wakeham up to speak with us now. Most of you, of course, will know Mark. He's the Campaigns Director at Environment Victoria. Has been an environmental activist for a very long time, although he's still quite young, of course. And as John Fane likes to call him, Mark is his favourite environmental warrior. So Mark is up here today to tell us about Environment Victoria's Pay to Pollute campaign.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you all so much for joining us here today. It's a really exciting day for our campaign. Thank you very much to Matt for stepping in at late notice and doing such a terrific job. And thanks very much to the Sustainable Living Festival for having us and for providing us with this nice cool venue today. There's a lot of room down the front, folks, if you're a late arrival, and the seats are much cooler down the front. The air is much cooler down the front. I'm only going to talk about climate change for a moment, and all I'm going to say is that, as we all know in this room, it threatens everything that is important to us, and everything that is critical to us, and everything that sustains life on this planet. It threatens our food, it threatens our water, it threatens our rivers, our oceans, our mountains, it threatens our economy, it threatens our homes, it threatens our kids, and it threatens entire nations and their ongoing prospects of survival. And as Kelly said, it threatens our coffee. So it's really serious, and it's about power and vested interests. Solving this issue is about power and vested interests. I've been working on climate change for around about a decade. Many others have been working on it for longer than that. And if we were having a rational discussion, if we were trying to win the argument on this issue, we would have won long ago. There's a very clear and present danger. Policymakers should be acting in the public interest, they're not. And it's because of the vested interests that are at play. And we all know that we can't afford to burn all the coal, oil and gas that is on the balance sheets of some of the most powerful corporations in the world. As Annie Leonard said on Friday, we need to keep the coal in the hole and the oil in the soil. She didn't have one for gas though. I have to ask her about that. So, we can't burn all of these resources. We have to fight the site battles. And the environment movement is good at that. Environment Victoria is good at that. We're good at fighting the next coal allocation that the Baillieu government wants to do, 13 billion tonnes of coal in the Latrobe Valley. We're good at putting issues like Hazelwood on the national agenda, even if when push comes to shove, the politicians don't have the courage to make the hard decisions. We're good at stopping new coal-fired power stations, and many people in this room played a historic role in stopping the HRL coal-fired power station proceeding. We need to fight the site battles. We need to protect the great